In June of 2005, a private jet touched down on a small island in the Persian Gulf. On board was the most famous entertainer on the planet, just weeks removed from a courtroom battle that had consumed the entire world's attention. He wasn't traveling with a record label entourage. He wasn't checking into a 5-star hotel with a rented security team. He was being received personally by the son of a king. 4 years earlier, his security had included members of one of the most controversial religious organizations in America. 4 years before that, his own hired guards were testifying against him in open court. And 4 years after Bahrain, the man who once had his own private fire department protecting his ranch would be guarded by exactly 2 people, driving him through American suburbs in an unmarked car with no backup and no days off. This is the real story of how Michael Jackson's protection changed. Not because he wanted a bigger entourage or a flashier motorcade, but because again and again, the people meant to protect him became part of the danger, and each time that happened, he was forced to rebuild his entire concept of safety from the ground up. To understand why Michael Jackson's security detail kept transforming, you have to understand something most fans overlook. Jackson wasn't just famous. He was, for nearly 4 decades, one of the most surveilled, most litigated, and most physically pursued human beings alive. Crowds didn't just want his autograph, they tried to climb into his cars. Reporters didn't just want interviews. They staked out hospital rooms and courthouse hallways for a single photograph. And by the early 1990s, he had become the subject of criminal investigations that would follow him for the rest of his life. Ordinary celebrity security, a couple of broad-shouldered men in dark suits, was built for autograph seekers and paparazzi. It was never designed for what Jackson was actually facing: organized religious groups angling for influence, hired guards willing to sell stories to tabloids, process servers, subpoenas, and eventually, financial collapse so severe it threatened to leave him with no protection at all. What follows are 9 realities about that evolution, verified through court records, sworn testimony, biographies, and first-hand accounts from the men who were actually there. Reality 1. Long before any of the chaos, there was one man standing quietly at the edge of every photograph: Bill Bray. In 1971, Joe Jackson, pushing his sons towards stardom with the Jackson 5, brought in Bray, an active Los Angeles Police Department officer, to keep an eye on the boys. At the time, it probably looked like a routine hire. A little extra muscle for a group of kids suddenly thrust into arenas full of screaming fans. Nobody could have predicted that Bray would still be standing beside Michael Jackson a quarter of a century later. Bray wasn't a typical bodyguard. He was trained law enforcement, and it showed in how he operated. Methodical, careful, rarely rattled. In his 1988 autobiography, Moonwalk, Jackson described him as very careful and immensely professional, someone who traveled with him virtually everywhere, sometimes as his only companion on short trips. Rolling Stone would later call Bray Jackson's top bodyguard and one of his closest confidants, the kind of description usually reserved for family, not staff. And that's exactly what Bray became. Jackson's relationship with his own father, Joe, was famously strained, marked by pressure, control, and, according to Jackson himself, very little warmth. Bray filled that gap. He didn't just organize security logistics. He escorted Jackson to doctor's appointments. He advised him on business decisions. He became, in the words of people close to the family, an alter ego and surrogate father. In a handwritten letter from 1992, later obtained and published by TMZ, Jackson wrote to Bray directly, "Joseph never ever had time for me. He only saw me as a way for him to make money. What I'm simply trying to say is thank you for being a father. I don't know what would have happened to me if you were not around." That's not a security testimonial. That's a son thanking someone for raising him. Bray stayed through the Jackson 5 years, through Jackson's explosive solo rise with Off the Wall and Thriller, and through the Bad, Dangerous, and History World Tours, 3 of the most logistically complex tours ever staged, each one requiring him to coordinate safety across dozens of countries. But in the mid-1990s, something shifted. Bray and Jackson had a falling out. The exact reason was never made public, and Bray quietly retired in 1996. Jackson kept paying for his medical insurance for years afterward. When Bray died in 2005 at 80 years old, Jackson's publicist said the singer was very, very, very saddened, calling Bray a longtime friend, mentor, and trusted advisor. By then, Jackson hadn't spoken to him in years. It's a strange, quietly tragic footnote. The man most responsible for keeping Michael Jackson physically safe for 25 years ended his life almost completely disconnected from the family he'd protected. But Bray's departure left something behind that mattered enormously: a void. And how that void got filled over the next decade tells you almost everything about why Jackson's security had to keep reinventing itself. Reality. 2. By the time Bray stepped away, Jackson had already lived through the first major crisis of his adult life, the 1993 child abuse allegations made by a 13-year-old boy. The case was settled out of court in early 1994 for a reported $23 million, without any admission of guilt. Jackson later said he'd agreed to the settlement to protect his career, a decision he said he came to regret. But the fallout from that period didn't stay in the past. It resurfaced almost a decade later, in 2005, when Jackson stood trial again, this time facing criminal charges. And it was during that trial that something happened which permanently reshaped how Jackson viewed the people working inside his own home. Ralph Chacon, a former Neverland Ranch security guard, took the witness stand and testified that years earlier he had personally witnessed conduct that implicated Jackson in serious misconduct with a child. A former Neverland maid, Adrienne McManus, gave testimony describing incidents she said she witnessed involving Jackson and visiting children. Jackson's defense team pushed back hard, pointing out that Chacon and several other former staff members had previously sued Jackson and lost, with the court ordering them to pay over $1.4 million in damages back to him. The defense argued their testimony was motivated by resentment, not truth. Whatever the jury ultimately believed, and they acquitted Jackson on all counts in June 2005, the damage to Jackson's sense of trust was already done. Think about what it means to have the very people you pay to guard your privacy stand up in a courtroom, under oath, and describe your private life to the entire world. It's one thing to fear outside threats, obsessive fans, tabloid reporters, unstable strangers. It's another thing entirely to realize the threat might already be inside the gate wearing your uniform. After the trial, Jackson's own attorney, Thomas Mesereau, said publicly that Jackson would no longer allow people easily into his life because he had become a target for people looking to extract money or build a career off his name. That single sentence explains almost every security decision Jackson made for the rest of his life. From that point forward, the goal wasn't just physical protection, it was radical minimization. Fewer people, fewer employees, fewer chances for betrayal. Reality. 3. To most of the world, Neverland Ranch looked like a whimsical playground. A Ferris wheel, a zoo, a movie theater, all sprawled across 2,700 acres in Santa Barbara County. But underneath that fantasy exterior was something closer to a self-contained, fortified compound. During Jackson's 2005 trial, testimony and property records revealed just how extensive Neverland's actual infrastructure was. There were hidden spaces throughout the property, including a wine cellar accessed through a hidden staircase behind a jukebox, and a panic room built into a closet off the master bedroom, equipped with a panic button and stocked with basic supplies, a standard security feature for high-profile estates. Not the sinister secret room rumors later suggested. But the panic room was almost the least of it. According to sworn testimony from ranch associate J.C. Agajanian, Neverland operated with a full-time security force, some guards in uniform, others working mobile patrol across the grounds, feeding into a private, secured surveillance room, where a bank of screens allowed staff to monitor nearly every corner of the property in real time. If a child near the pool got into trouble, security could see it happen and respond immediately. And the ranch didn't stop at guards and cameras. It had its own on-site fire department, its own paramedics, and its own helicopter, meaning Jackson had effectively built emergency services that answered to him alone, rather than waiting on a public response that could take precious minutes to arrive at a rural property that size. This wasn't excess for the sake of excess. It was Jackson engineering total self-sufficiency, a place where he didn't have to rely on outside authorities, outside emergency responders, or outside anyone to keep the people on his property safe. It's worth remembering that even today, more than 2 decades after Jackson stopped living there, current owners still maintain around-the-clock security at Neverland, including aerial drones monitoring the perimeter, a testament to just how much ongoing public fascination the property still generates, and how seriously security continues to be taken there. Reality 4. By December 2003, Jackson was once again facing criminal charges. New accusations from a different family, a new grand jury, a new media firestorm. And in the middle of that crisis, something unusual started happening around him. The Associated Press, citing multiple sources close to Jackson's camp who spoke on condition of anonymity, reported that members of the Nation of Islam, the black nationalist religious movement led by Louis Farrakhan, had begun playing an active role in Jackson's affairs. According to those sources, Nation of Islam members had taken over handling security at Neverland Ranch and had started moving into aspects of Jackson's business dealings as well. The Nation of Islam publicly denied having any official relationship with Jackson. But Jackson's own longtime business advisor, Former EMI records chief Charles Koppelman didn't deny their presence. He simply tried to define its limits. "It's not the case as to his music, finances, and assets," Koppelman told reporters. "I think it's primarily in security." It wasn't just security, though, at least according to some of the people around Jackson at the time. The New York Times later reported that senior Nation of Islam figures had moved into a rented house with Jackson and were actively advising him on his finances and his media strategy heading into the criminal trial. One senior Jackson employee, speaking anonymously, went further, telling reporters the group had taken over completely and was in full and total charge of decisions ranging from who could speak to media to how the family's money was being handled. Jackson's attorney at the time, Mark Garagos, downplayed the controversy, acknowledging that Nation of Islam Chief of Staff Leonard Mohammed had stood behind him at a press conference announcing the charges, but insisting the group wasn't formally part of Jackson's legal defense. Jackson himself was never a member of the Nation of Islam, according to his own family, though his brother Jermaine had converted to mainstream Islam years earlier, and it was reportedly Jermaine who first brought Leonard Mohammed into Jackson's orbit. Whatever the precise truth of their involvement, the optics were impossible to ignore. A group widely associated in the media with controversial rhetoric was now standing at the center of the world's most famous entertainer's protection, at the exact moment he needed the public's trust the most. Reality. 5. Just days before Jackson's arraignment on the new charges in early 2004, his camp made a calculated, almost surgical decision. Sources told ABC News that the Nation of Islam would not be handling Jackson's personal security at his court appearance. Instead, the singer brought in a separate, low-profile private security firm, specifically, according to those sources, to project a more humble, low-key image to the public, just as he faced a grand jury. Think about what that decision actually reveals. This wasn't purely a safety calculation. It was image management, executed through the choice of who stood physically closest to him in front of the cameras. Jackson's team understood that in the era of 24-hour cable news, the visual message sent by his security detail could shape public perception just as much as anything said in a courtroom. A discreet, unassuming firm signaled humility. A visibly militant-looking entourage signaled defiance. And with his freedom on the line, humility won out. It's a detail most retrospectives skip entirely. But it shows just how far security decisions had drifted from simple physical protection. By 2004, who guarded Michael Jackson was itself a form of public communication. Reality 6. On June 13, 2005, after a 14-week trial that left him visibly frail, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all 10 counts against him. And then he simply vanished. For nearly 2 weeks, nobody in the public knew where he was. When he resurfaced, it was on the other side of the world, in the small Gulf kingdom of Bahrain, as the personal guest of Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad Al Khalifa, the son of Bahrain's king and a close friend of Jackson's brother Jermaine. This wasn't a hotel stay. According to Jackson's own brother, the family had reportedly discussed sending Jackson to Bahrain even before the verdict came in, partly because, at the time, Bahrain had no extradition treaty with the United States. Once acquitted, Jackson didn't need that safety net, but he used the relationship anyway, moving into palatial grounds provided by Sheikh Abdullah, who covered his living expenses, travel costs, and legal advisors, and who eventually built him a private recording studio on site. For nearly a year, Jackson lived under a level of protection that simply doesn't exist for ordinary celebrities, the informal but very real security apparatus that surrounds a ruling royal family. Photographs from the period show him in public wearing an abaya, the traditional Gulf robe, along with a veil covering his face, a disguise that let him move through public spaces in a region where, by some accounts, he had a substantial and devoted fan base, largely unrecognized. The arrangement eventually soured. Sheikh Abdullah later sued Jackson in a British court, claiming he'd fronted millions of dollars for an album, an autobiography, and a stage play that never materialized. Money Jackson's team maintained had been a personal gift, not a loan. The case was settled out of court in 2008, just before Jackson was set to testify in London. But strip away the financial dispute, and what's left is remarkable on its own terms. For nearly a full year, the King of Pop's personal safety was underwritten not by hired professionals, but by the literal protective infrastructure of a sovereign state. Few entertainers in history have ever had that option. Fewer still have needed it. Reality 7. By the time Jackson returned to American soil in the years that followed, something had fundamentally changed. Gone were the days of ranch-wide security forces and royal palace protection. In their place was an operation so small it's almost hard to believe. Starting around December 2006, two men became Jackson's entire personal security detail. Bill Whitfield, a former police officer and security industry veteran, and Javon Beard, a younger, less experienced, but fiercely loyal partner. Both were single fathers themselves, a detail that would come to matter given how much of their job involved caring for Jackson's own 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. For 2.5 years, Whitfield and Beard were stationed with Jackson and his family nearly around the clock, moving from city to city, Las Vegas, Ireland, Virginia, and eventually back to Los Angeles, as Jackson lived in near total seclusion, trying to rebuild both his finances and a sense of normal life for his kids. In their memoir, Remember the Time, published years later, the 2 men described the intensity of the arrangement in stark terms. They were the only 3 people who knew where Michael Jackson actually was at any given moment, and because of that, there were no scheduled days off. There was no rotating shift of backup guards. If they weren't physically present, there was no one else Jackson trusted to be. That's an almost unimaginable shift for a man who once had a private fire department and his own helicopter. But it also reveals something important about what Jackson valued most in this final phase of his life. He wasn't chasing scale anymore. He wasn't trying to look protected. He was trying to disappear, to live quietly with his kids, help them with homework, get them to school, and avoid becoming a headline. Whitfield and Beard weren't hired to project strength to the outside world. They were hired to make the outside world go away. Reality 8. One of the strangest tools in Jackson's later security strategy wasn't a person guarding him. It was a person pretending to be him. Navi, a professional Michael Jackson impersonator who had built a career studying and replicating Jackson's look, voice, and movement, has said publicly that he was actually hired at times to work as a decoy for the real Jackson. In one recounted incident, Navi described being escorted out by police and security while a fan grabbed onto the vehicle, screaming Jackson's name, completely unaware that the man inside wasn't Jackson at all. It's a tactic more associated with presidents and foreign dignitaries than pop stars, using a convincing double to absorb public attention and physical risk, while the real principle moves separately, unnoticed. But by this stage of his life, with crowds still capable of overwhelming any security detail on site, misdirection had become just as valuable to Jackson's team as raw physical protection. Now, Whitfield and Beard's own accounts back this up in spirit, if not in the exact decoy tactic. They described one moment where, to defuse an escalating crowd situation, Whitfield told a police officer that the man in the car was actually the musician Prince, not Michael Jackson. And it worked. Jackson, listening from inside the vehicle, reportedly laughed and said, "No wonder why they left us alone." Small moments like that reveal something the headlines never captured. Jackson's later security wasn't built on intimidation or force. It was built on quick thinking, improvisation, and a very simple truth. The less anyone believed Michael Jackson was actually present, the safer Michael Jackson actually was. Reality 9. Perhaps the most sobering reality of all. By the final years of his life, Jackson's financial situation had deteriorated so severely that it began directly affecting the very people protecting him. Whitfield and Beard have spoken openly about the financial instability during their time with Jackson, describing periods where their own pay was suspended for weeks at a time, even as they continued working around the clock, staying with the family and covering Jackson's 3 children. It's a jarring image once you sit with it. This is a man who, at his commercial peak, was arguably the single biggest entertainer on the planet. And yet, in his final years, he was reportedly navigating debts estimated near $500 million, forced to sell Neverland Ranch outright, all while the 2 men standing between him and the outside world sometimes went without paychecks. And still, by all accounts, Whitfield and Beard stayed, not because the money was reliable, but because, over 2.5 years, their relationship with Jackson and his children had become something closer to family than employment. That loyalty, in the end, might be the truest form of security Jackson ever had. Not cameras, not helicopters, not royal palaces, but 2 people who chose to stay even when the paycheck didn't show up. So when people ask why Michael Jackson's security kept changing, the answer isn't really about threat levels or bigger crowds or louder fans. It's about trust, how fast it can collapse, and how carefully it has to be rebuilt each time. He started with one police officer who became a father figure. He lost that man to a falling out no one ever explained. He watched his own hired staff take the stand against him. He handed his safety to a controversial religious group and quietly walked it back days before facing a judge. He fled across the world into the protection of a royal family, and he ended his life being kept alive day to day by exactly 2 men who never clocked out, sometimes without even getting paid. Every single one of those shifts tells the same story from a different angle. Michael Jackson spent the last 2 decades of his life searching for people who wouldn't use their access to him against him. Sometimes he found them, sometimes he didn't. And in the end, understanding his security, isn't really about understanding bodyguards at all. It's about understanding a man who, for all his fame, spent his final years just trying to find a handful of people he could actually trust.